So, all right, only starting 6 minutes late. So it was supposed to be the exam day, but just as a reminder, the exam is again pushed back to the 4th of April. It won't have a ton of content. Likewise, the final probably won't have a ton of content, just because we're trying to sort of pull things together, and it's hard to test you on things like constructing B boxes and the like. So, which, by the way, thank you for the help, much appreciated. Got us ahead of schedule. But I still have last time's exam, so if you haven't picked it up yet, feel free to swing by or come up and talk to me right after class. Can get it. So last time, what we were talking about, right, was I was sort of walking through a regular Hive examination, right? So we were showing sort of how you take the boxes apart, how you move down through, and ultimately take a look at the frames to figure out if the box is healthy or not. And if I remember correctly, where we wrapped up was I was talking about what it is you're actually looking for when you have the Hive opened up. So first and foremost, what you're really looking for is signs that you have healthy brood. Typically, actually, before I get started, we had a question about, Roger, did you ask me a question?
I might have, I don't remember.
Ah, shucks. I'm sure it'll come to me later.
Something about the opening?
Oh, yeah, whether you need to put a entrance restrictor in or not. So let's see, where are my entrance restrictors? Well, you've all seen them, right? Yeah. They're those pieces of wood with the little troughs cut out of them. Some people really like entrance reducers. If you're up in the northern climates, you more or less have to use them for the winter time, just because, I mean, if you look at a beehive, right, when it's set up, just gonna pop this right here. So, I mean, this is the summer entrance, and if you look at it, it's a reasonably large hole all the way across the bottom of the hive that the bees can get in and out of. And so there's not a whole lot of control on what can get in here, and there are some pests of bees that like to live in the hive. So if you're going to get wax moths, if you're going to get small hive beetles, if you're going to get mice living in your hives like they do sometimes, they're just going to crawl in through this hole because it's nice and large. Whereas if you put a restrictor in, here, excuse me, Jeff. One of these guys, right? The upside is you restrict the size of the entrance. So now the bees can only enter through here, and this makes things a lot easier for the bees to guard. You get a couple guard bees in there, and they can stop whatever it is from getting in. You don't need to dedicate a large group of bees to guarding the entrance. That being said, I'm a little torn about this because here in Fresno, my main concern over the summer is how stinking hot it's going to get. And the bigger the entrance is, the more airflow you're going to get through the hive. The easier it's going to be for the bees to start fanning hot air out and pulling cool air in and keeping air circulation. In the wintertime, you have the opposite problem, right? Where you're trying to keep the hive warm. So in northern climates, almost everybody uses hive reducers because it's got this nice little entrance in it. And you can just sort of do this in the wintertime and create a nice tight little entrance that's big enough for 1 or 2 bees at a time and really restrict that airflow so you can keep the warm air all up in your hive. And we'll talk about winter maintenance here in a minute. And a big part of winter maintenance is just keeping the hive warm. So, but to get to my point, here in Fresno, the temperatures never really get that cold, but they do get hot. So I feel like airflow is important. And then on top of that, when I read a lot of resources, a lot of people say things like, well, I don't use a hive reducer, I just put like mesh in front of my entrances to keep pests out or this or that. And so it seems like a lot of people don't use these. So
this guy uses like that brings bees to us or to get our pollen or whatever. He puts like newspaper and shoves it in there.
Yeah.
Well, that's nice. I guess you lost your hive reducer or something. But
yeah. No, exactly. So I mean, that's the thing. There's the saying, right? If you ask 10 beekeepers the same question, you'll get 15 different answers. Like, everybody's just doing whatever they think is right.
They say the same thing about farmers, actually.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Farming and beekeeping, I mean, beekeeping is just farming with bugs. So I'm not surprised. But,
I had a question about undertaker bees.
yeah.
So I noticed that, first, sometimes I see like dead bees right in front of my hives, and that's pretty normal because I've seen other hives with a bunch of dead bees out in the front. But I've also noticed that bees will fly out of the hive carrying dead bees and take them somewhere else. I want to know what the difference is. Why do some just get dumped in the front, and why do some get carried off?
I have no idea. That's interesting. I've never heard of bees like carrying them a good distance from the hive. Makes you wonder. I wonder if the bees can tell the difference. Some bees have really good hygiene habits, and I'm wondering if more hygienic bees can tell the difference between a bee that's died of old age versus one that's maybe infected with something. And you don't want infected bees piling up near your entrance where the things like nosema or chalk brood or various other diseases we'll talk about later in the semester may, sporulate and get pulled into your hive. So they may be taking them far away just for hygienic reasons.
Last question, from me at least. What if you just give them honey to help build them, like so they can build home, like supplement them with honey? Would that work, or?
We'll talk about that, but you can. You just need to make sure the honey's clean. So, but we'll talk about that today, assuming people quit asking me questions. All right. No. Okay, so we talked about this before, right? This is sort of where we wrapped up. But in general, when you're looking at brood, what you really want is this sort of pattern. You want a nice, tight sphere, or maybe a sort of squash sphere that fits the frame of roughly complete brood. I mean, you'll have some openings where maybe one of the brood died, or maybe they emerged as an adult already. But in general, you want this nice, clean, circular pattern. That's a good sign of healthy brood. There are signs of unhealthy brood. Some of these you can look for are sunken caps. So the cap should be a little bit convex on the top or flat. But if the brood is sick or dead, the cap will sort of sink in and bow inside. Sometimes they'll have little holes in them. There are some diseases like European foul brood and American foul brood where they will rot in the frame and it'll just smell terrible. Like they say, it smells like rotten eggs. So if you have a bad infection, you'll be able to smell that the moment you open the hive. You'll get a big waft of rotting larvae. And so those are all things you should be looking for. And these are just some signs, some of what bad brood looks like. So this is chilled brood. This would be a case where maybe you're doing a late season inspection. It's a little bit cold, and you left it open too long, and the larvae died because they got exposed to the cold temperatures. So you'll see the larvae are all on the bottom. They're just black. This is an example of an American foul brood. You can sort of see, it's a little hard to tell, but this cap is sunken. So it's dipped in a little bit. And this one has some holes in the top of it, which is unusual. And then this is a sign of a queen that needs replaced. You can see there's no real sign of dead brood or anything, but we've got a sort of a shotgun pattern going on here of capping that looks like the queen's just laying wherever she wants. And whenever you see this and it's not a nice tight ball, that's a sign that your queen is too old. She's probably out of sperm and she's just laying drones.
So in that case, you would just introduce a new one?
Yes. Yeah, so you could replace her. If you're going through and you see some queen cells, you could just let them replace her as they need to.
I thought they were going to do that on their own.
They can. Eventually, they should replace their own queen. Sometimes what happens, right, is you get a situation like this, and they've tried, and you can see they're doing that, right? Look at all these queen cells at the top. They're trying to replace their queen. That's another sign that the queen needs replaced. Sometimes they'll go through that process, and they won't have any success, in which case, you'll have to replace the queen yourself. But, yeah, I think there's a lot of solutions to queen problems. Another thing you should be looking for is the presence of eggs. Generally, when you're checking your frames, you want to find the queen. Sometimes it's hard to find the queen because she looks a lot like the other bees. So oftentimes what people will do is they'll check the eggs as sort of a proxy of whether the queen is there. If you look down in the brood laying area and you see single eggs laid in the bottom of the cells, that means you got a healthy queen. But if you see something like this, where there are lots of eggs laid in the cells, that means your queen is gone. This means that the workers have turned into drone-laying workers. The queen is gone, so their ovaries are no longer suppressed by that queen hormone or queen pheromone, and so, or the queen tergite pheromone. And so they've started laying their eggs, and the workers aren't particularly picky. They'll lay their eggs all over the place, and those will all just turn into drones. And ultimately keeping an eye out for the development of queen cups and cells. So basically, are there any signs that the queen is being replaced? So if you find, cups hanging off the bottom versus on the cells, those could be signs, excuse me, of replacement. And it's pretty important to be able to differentiate supersedure versus emergency cells. So if you may remember, supersedure and swarm cells, when they're planning on dividing the hive or killing the queen or replacing her themselves, they tend to accumulate along the bottom of the frames like this. Whereas if the queen has died mysteriously and without providing her replacement, the workers will just extend a worker cell and create an emergency replacement queen cup off of that.
You can replace a queen any time of year, right?
You can up until sort of mid-early fall. You don't want to replace a queen late in the fall when you're heading into winter, because that won't give the hive enough time for the queen to establish and to lay good compact brood for the overwintering period. But otherwise, I believe you can replace the queen most any time. Yeah. Beyond that, when you're inspecting hives, it's just generally a good time to take a look at your equipment. So look at your frames, look at your boxes, make sure everything is in order. Replace or repair things that are broken. Yeah. Good time to scrape up all the bird comb, get rid of the dead bees that are stuck in your feeder, right? General, just good maintenance stuff to make sure that your equipment is in good shape. Take a look for forage. So you looked at that brood. Take a look around the brood. See, do you have that pollen buildup, right? Do you have evidence of honey being stored up as well around the brood? And in general, this is also a good time just to make any number of seasonal adjustments. So we're going to jump into seasonal adjustments after we get done with the general hive inspection. So we'll go into this in more detail. But these are generally good times to apply medications or pesticides if you're planning on using those. Providing food and sugar sources. Changing the entrance size, which we just talked about. Replacing broken components. All of those things sort of happen during the hive inspection. So there is a seasonality to what you do. There are certain times of year where certain things happen during hive inspections. So in the fall time, the big things that we're looking for are making sure that you have adequate honey and pollen for the winter period, mostly making sure they have adequate honey. And then also checking to see if the bees have shaped a nice sort of brood ball in order to cluster around during the winter time. Whereas in the spring, you're mostly checking for overwintering success and basically making sure that your bees are set up to be successful. So you're checking for evidence of successful forage. Does it look like the bees are out and about and finding everything they need? And then doing basic maintenance around swarming. So if the bees are doing really well and they're like full up to the top of your hive, this is the time where you start making splits, dividing a strong hive into smaller hives, sharing frames from a strong hive with weak hives, and then adding and removing supers as appropriate to basically increase or reduce the hive size. And again, we're going to talk about seasonal maintenance, so we'll get all that in more detail. So just a couple wrap-up details before we end this lecture. Robbing, it's generally not recommended to open up your hives and do extended basic maintenance when there's not very good forage around, right? So if I'm opening up my hives and the bees don't have a lot of forage, they're getting pretty agitated, they're going to be really tempted to go into those separated hive boxes and start stealing food, right? And oftentimes when we go in and we do basic maintenance on hives, we're actually creating conditions that encourage robbing. So if I go out there with a smoker and I puff the hive, I'm calming down the bees, but I'm also calming down the guards that normally keep robbers out. So you're basically getting rid of the guards that protect the hive. You're then cracking it open and creating multiple entrances for the bees to get in. And if you're sitting there and you're scraping your burr comb off and you're throwing it in a bucket or something, or you're doing something irresponsible and you're throwing it on the ground, which you're not supposed to do, that is sort of a real attractive feature to a foraging bee. It'll sort of draw them in to where you have that open hive, and they'll start crawling in and burgling the place. Now, there's a lot of issues with robbing. One is that once robbing starts and a hive is obviously a source of honey that the bees want to steal, it's really hard to stop robbing. You can even put the hive back together and reduce the entrance, and the bees will still keep coming to it and try to rob it continuously. So sort of as a Pandora's box. Once you open it, it's hard to put the lid back on and stop the bees from stealing everything. Also, when there's robbing going on, the bees are going to become more defensive, so it's going to make it harder for you to do your job, getting in and out of those boxes. And ultimately, if those bees that are doing if any of the bees are diseased, bees tend to rob from weaker hives, which oftentimes are going to be hives with some disease issues in them. So if all of a sudden you got foragers from other hives coming in and stealing from it, they're going to pick up that disease and spread it to your other hives. And so it's a really easy way for disease to spread. So as far as robbing is concerned, prevention is really the best medicine to robbing. So in general, you want to avoid opening the hives when the forage is poor as much as possible. That being said, we're about to talk about Labor Day checks, which are sort of right in that period. Excuse me. Keeping the hives in good condition, so avoiding cracks or holes in the hive that robbers could get in through. Using entrance reducers for weak colonies to create a smaller guardable gap to basically protect them. And you can also place robbing screen over the entrances to stop robbers from getting in. So this is what a robbing screen looks like. This was new to me, so kind of interesting. But basically what a robbing screen is it's a little wooden frame with some fine mesh screen over the front of it. You have an entrance reducer put on the front that you can close or open with these little metal slats. And the basic idea of a robbing screen is that you have a mesh screen and the entrance is up here at the top now instead of down here at the bottom. So when the bees exit the hive through the regular entrance, which is behind this, they have to crawl up the wall and out through the entrance up here. Now, when robbing bees come to rob the hive, they'll fly up and they'll see the bees crawling out through that entrance through the mesh. And they'll basically say, oh, that's the entrance. And they'll try to fly in, and they'll just keep bopping the screen, basically. They aren't able to get in and actually rob the hive. But if you put this on at night or when it's cold and the bees aren't coming in and out, the bees will learn to use that upper entrance because they'll have to crawl out through it to get out of the hive. So the foragers that belong will find the entrance. The robbers are ideally not going to, or at least not right away. All right, so feeding bees. We got some questions about feeding bees this morning, just so luck happens that we're talking about it. But bees have two food sources, right? They need carbs in the form of nectar or honey, and they need protein or pollen, which is only needed when rearing brood. And in general, the rule of thumb is that bees always need carbohydrates, all the time. That's sort of how they keep themselves going. But pollen is only needed when it's brood rearing time. So that's going to be during the spring expansion, when they are, coming out of the overwintering period. And that's going to be in the late fall, right when they're prepping for the overwintering. So those are the 2 times you need to make sure there's a lot of protein resources. That being said, a lot of beekeepers do feed their hives. Again, like I said earlier, 10 beekeepers, 15 different answers. People are all over the board about when you should feed or when you shouldn't feed, whether you should feed at all. Some beekeepers don't believe in giving resources to bees, at least not giving them sugar syrup. So it's all over the place. But in general, what you'll find is that people do feed bees for a variety of reasons. To avoid starvation is probably one of the most common ones. So if you open up the hive, there's just not a lot of resources in there. Or if you're somewhere like the Central Valley, where there may be extended periods of time where there's no good forage, some people will just give their bees some sugar solution. Feeding a medication. So many of the medications, especially the stuff for bacteria or fungi, are distributed through sugar syrups. So you would need to feed them in order to give that medication. Providing food for newly captured bees or purchased bees. Producing better quality virgin bees. So sometimes when there's a queen replacement going on, it's good to feed them so that the bees can produce a high quality queen. Yeah. Increase drone production or improve foundation production. So for example, I caught a swarm about a week ago, and I have been feeding those bees since I got them on and off, just to help them build some, basically build a foundation on those frames. Their frames, right, are just like this. So they've got the plastic base with beeswax on it, but they don't have any comb. And since it takes about, 8 pounds of honey to make 1 pound of wax, I don't see the harm in giving them a little sugar water to help them establish their new comb right now, even though there's a ton of forage around. Just trying to be helpful. So we talked about feeding them sugar. What type of sugar do you feed to bees? General rule of thumb is that bees can utilize virtually any sugar for food if it is provided to them in a liquid form. Bees prefer their sugar to look like nectar. There are solid forms you can feed them, but in general, you can give them most anything as long as it's liquid. That being said, a lot of beekeepers are always looking for the next thing to feed their bees that is cheap, and so that oftentimes leads them to take sugars that are like byproducts of various companies and production processes. And this can backfire on you because oftentimes these sugars contain additives that the bees don't like the taste of and they'll reject it. And one thing you need to make sure to avoid is anything that contains galactose or lactose. Bees cannot digest this, it's toxic, it'll build up in their system. So these are really common byproducts of milk. So don't purchase any sugar that's made through any sort of milk manufacturing process, or that is milk-derived products in it. In general, what I found recommended is granulated white sugar is the easiest sugar to find, it's super inexpensive, and bees love it. From a metabolic perspective, it's very, very similar digestively to what they get from flowers. Bees treat it the same way as they do nectar from flowers, and so in general, plain old-fashioned granulated white sugar is perfectly fine to feed the bees. A big debate I found when researching this is whether or not to use high fructose corn syrup. And, it's one of those things that a lot of bee experts will say, don't feed your bees corn syrup. It's not good for them. But it is a super common resource that we do see people using. The major issue we see with this is that if it gets overheated, it can create hydroxymethylfurfural. Furfural? Anyway, but this stuff is bad for bees. It's bad for people consuming honey, so you just don't want it. And the other issue is that bees oftentimes, if given high fructose corn syrup, it's thick enough and it's honey-like enough that they won't bother converting it into honey. They'll just store it directly as their sugar source, in which case you end up with frames that are maybe part honey, part high fructose corn syrup, or all high fructose corn syrup. And that's not what you're aiming for if you're doing this for the honey, right? So partially it depends on your needs. If you're like a guy who is in the game for honey, or honey's a big part of your business, then you probably don't want this high fructose corn syrup. But if you're out there trying to make your money off of pollination, and you're just trying to get your bees through, and you get a great deal on high fructose corn syrup, maybe it's a good tool for you to get your bees through a hard patch. But again, granulated white sugar is dirt cheap and easy to use as well. So in general, we see there are two types of syrup formulations most people use. It's pretty straightforward. There is thick syrup, which is 2 parts sugar to 1 part water, or a 3-to-2 ratio. And this is what people tend to give the bees for the fall or winter storage periods. That is before winter occurs. This is just a good resource the bees can convert relatively quickly and is sugar rich. And then there's the dilute syrup, which is a 1-to-1 ratio. And this is what you give the bees in the spring or during any period where you want to stimulate brood production.
Which one's the one that they can't sell? The one that they gave you, or you bought?
I think they gave me more like a 1-to-1. I'd have to check. It's pretty thick. It might actually be the thick syrup.
The day we went, I tried to ask questions about it, but he didn't really seem more telling it.
Yeah.
He didn't want to tell me.
I'll admit, yeah, Daydan seems a little protective. I think theirs isn't just a straight up sugar solution. I believe theirs is a little bit more proprietary. I think they have some specific sugar ratios, and they might add some additional nutrients as well. Because they do pitch it really as like a bit more than just simple sugar syrup.
And it's like $5 a gallon.
Yeah, it's
$5.60 or something.
it's definitely pricier than the 1-to-1 sugar to water ratio. But I opened it up when I was feeding them, and it's pretty thick stuff. So
I thought you were about to say you tried it real quick.
I didn't try it. I don't think there's anything. I didn't want to get my fingers in it just because I don't want to spoil a whole stinking like 3-gallon bucket of nectar. But anyway, another big conversation that I've seen amongst the community is how you feed the bees. The general impression I get is there's not a wrong way to feed bees. One of the popular styles of feeder are these top feeders, where basically you have a box that's lined with a rubber or a plastic, and you fill that with the sugar solution, and then up through the middle, there's a little raised platform that the bees can crawl up through and then down in to feed on the sugar. There are external feeders. So they call these external feeders, but they're not necessarily external. Basically, what you can do, right, is you can take a box like this. Just a plain old-fashioned empty box. You can go put that on top of your hive body with your frames in it, and you can take one of those external feeders full of sugar and just pop it in there right on top of the frames. And then the bees will crawl up out of the frames and feed directly on the sugar in the feeders. We're using a variation of that in the hives right now. The advantage of that is it's all internal, so the bees don't have to come out to get to it, and it discourages robbing. Because if I put an external feeder right on top of the lid, bees from anywhere can come and feed on it, and you might increase the chances that they want to investigate the hive and take their resources. And then we have the in-frame feeders. We've seen these a few times. These seem to be really popular with a lot of keepers right now, right? Just a plastic frame-shaped bucket that you can fill with sugar solution, just pop in the place of a 10th frame, and the bees will just crawl in and take whatever they need.
If you just get a new swarm, what kind of sugar would you want to get it? A thicker or dilute? Probably dilute,
Yeah, so what you're trying to do right with the dilute sugar is mostly stimulate brood production and establish comb. And so I've seen dilute recommended as sort of what you're supposed to use in the springtime when you're capturing swarms. All right. One note is that it's not recommended to feed liquid sugars during the winter period. The reason for this is that during the winter we see wide fluctuations in temperature, right? And if you hit a night where it's freezing and then it warms up in the afternoon, you're going to cause the liquid in those jars to expand and contract pretty widely. And what will happen is a lot of these feeders, right, are just like a ball jar or something with a lid on it. Actually, if you want to make your own feeder, what you do is you just get like a standard mason jar with a metal lid, get a 6-penny nail, so one of those really thin nails, and just bang like 8 or 9 holes in the top of it. You fill that with the syrup, you turn it upside down on top of the frames, and it'll drizzle for a little bit, and then the vacuum will sort of form equilibrium, and the bees will have to come up and stick their proboscis up into the holes to pull the syrup out. And it's okay to let the syrup drip on the bees when you first start feeding them. Oftentimes that stimulates the bees. So if the bees get a big syrupy mess inside their hive, they'll just clean it up and repackage it. But it also tells them there's a sugar source above them, so they'll crawl up to the feeder. Whereas in the wintertime, the issue then is just that it's going to be doing that all the time. You're going to be contracting and expanding, contracting and expanding. The syrup's going to drizzle out onto the bees. And given that in winter, bees are trying their hardest to keep the hive warm and trying to avoid that, trying to avoid, any sort of chilling and brood death, dripping cold syrup on them all day long is not a good idea. Yeah. And bees generally also won't venture far enough in the hive to actually feed on liquid sources during the winter time, and it can be attractive to pests, so it's just generally not a good idea. Instead, what you can do is feed them solid sugars. In general, it's recommended that you use dry-vert sugar, which is fondant sugar used in bakeries. The issue I've heard about dry-vert sugar is it's expensive, like really expensive to buy a big bag of dry-vert sugar. In a pinch, you can give bees granulated sugar dry as an emergency food. But what a lot of hives will actually do is they'll gather it up and throw it out the entrance. And so, they don't always take to it. What is recommended is you can make sugar cakes, or you can purchase sugar cakes, and bees will utilize that. This is a basic recipe they gave in the book, but functionally it's 15 pounds of white sugar, 3 pounds of white corn syrup, and 4 cups of water. And you basically heat that up to about 242 degrees Fahrenheit. You need one of those candy thermometers. And then you just pour it out into candy dishes. Or you could pour it out into like one of those foil disposable baking dishes. And it'll harden into a cake. The advantage of a candy dish, right, is you'll have these little patties of sugar that you can just chuck on top of your hive. If you make like just a big tray of it, you can smash it with a hammer and put the shards in the hive. But the idea is you'll end up with something like this, a solid cake of sugar, and the bees will eat that. Bees need liquid sugar to survive, but they'll regurgitate their honey stomach contents up onto it to dissolve the sugar and then suck it back up, so they can access this stuff.
I have a question. So earlier when you mentioned good sugar sources, granulated white sugar was one of them.
If you dissolve it in water.
If dissolved in water.
So yes, if I didn't make that clear, granulated sugar is widely used by bees. They don't seem to mind. Oh, another thing. I had my sister-in-law works for a sort of an industry museum, and she gets tours of various facilities. And she went out to the Domino sugar plant in Baltimore. And just so you know, basically on the sugar floor, they just have these big piles of sugar, and they just scoop them up and put them into the processor for bagging. And it doesn't matter what sugar you buy. Domino's, store brand, whatever, They all come from the same big heap of sugar in the middle of the processing floor. So don't spend your money on the expensive sugar. It's all the same. Everybody makes the same dollars. So, and the bees won't know the difference either. So don't go out there and buy like a big thing of Domino sugar if you can get like great value. But anyway, yeah. So if you're using granulated sugar or any of that stuff, just make sure you're putting it into a water solution. You can't just chuck granulated sugar into the hive. The bees won't like it. Although there are stories of bees using it in a pinch. All right, feeding honey. So yeah.
Sorry.
Where's Rabbit? He asked me this question. He's never gonna know. Nobody tell Ronbeer feeding honey. I don't want him to know if he's just gonna leave.
Earlier you said if corn syrup gets heated, it creates the pearl stuff.
I mean, methoxy for
But in the recipe for the sugar cake, it says that it's heated to 242. What's the cutoff?
So that is high fructose corn syrup versus white corn syrup.
Oh.
So slightly different products. Okay. Feeding honey. So we talked a lot about giving them syrup and odds and ends like that. That being said, bees eat honey, so you can just give them honey to eat. In general, if you're giving honey, what you're doing is you're not like providing honey in a feeder or anything. You're just giving bees new frames of honey that you can just pop in. And generally the way this is done is, let's say you have a weak hive and it's really struggling. You don't think it has enough honey supplies to get through the winter. And then next door you've got a great big hive that's got like 2 or 3 super, like just ridiculous amounts of honey going on. And you know they're fine. You can just take some of the honey from the healthy hive and pop it into the weak hive. And they'll just use that honey, no problem. Just got to make sure you brush the workers off before you put the new honey frames in. Something I've seen recommended is if you're doing this during the winter period, so let's say you're concerned that your weak hive's not going to make it, you want to give them some extra honey, it's recommended that if you pull some honey out of a stronger hive, that you slash it a little bit so that the honey will leak out, and you put it right above the main hive body. And the idea is that when the honey drips out, that'll stimulate the bees to feed and to go and clean out those frames. And they'll repackage the honey. And when they repackage it, they're going to package it down by the brood. And they're going to tighten up the brood ball to basically accommodate all the extra honey. And so that's a good way to stimulate the bees to create a good brood structure for the winter period. Yeah. So let's say you want to do a lot of honey feeding. You want to give your bees as much honey as you can and avoid sugar syrup. You can store honeycomb long-term in a freezer or an airtight container. I've heard, my impression is that the freezer is the best way to go, just because if you use an airtight container, there's always the chance that you're storing these things at room temperature with a bunch of pests in it. Maybe there's some wax moth eggs or some small hive beetle eggs or something like that, and they're just going to consume everything in that container. Whereas with the freezer, you pop it in the freezer, nothing's going to grow. You just have to make sure you thaw it out before you pop it into the new hive. Don't put cold honey in the hive. I think Rocky said that on Thursday, right? If you put a cold frame in, it's just going to suck the heat out of the hive, and that's bad for the bees. They like a nice warm hive. Okay, so that's sugar feeding. I don't have as much to say about feeding protein. The only thing I'm going to say is basically there are 2 main protein sources. In general, there's lots of different things you can feed bees. Everybody has their own opinions about what you should feed bees. But in general, you can split it up into 2 major categories. There are pollen supplements and pollen substitutes. A pollen supplement is basically pollen collected from bees that has been formulated into some sort of protein you can put on the top of the hive. Whereas a pollen substitute is a protein that does not have any pollen in it whatsoever. So sort of like that peanut buttery stuff we saw at Day Day, right? In general, generally what it is it's some protein from an inexpensive stock like soybeans mixed with a ton of sugar. When I talk to beekeepers, a lot of them are really down on buying pollen supplements because, let's see, I think actually, no. Oftentimes the pollen is sourced from countries like India and China where there's not much of a regulatory environment. So it's not super clear what plants the pollen comes from. It's not super clear if there's insecticides or fungicides or herbicides on the pollen. And in general, people just don't want to give their bees anything that they don't know approximately what's in it, especially considering that pollen is almost exclusively fed to brood, which are super sensitive to chemical profiles. You don't want to accidentally give the brood something bad that's going to kill them off or cause a weak hive. Yeah. Generally with a protein supplement though, what you're going to have is some sort of patty like this. You just flatten it out, chuck it onto the top of the frames, usually with some sort of wax paper underneath it. The bees will just chew right through that. And they'll just come up and feed right off the tops of the frames. Easy as that.
You know what Daydance formula is?
I have no idea. What is it?
I don't know.
You don't know?
Compared to Beltsville? You know the Beltsville Bee Lab?
No, what's Beltsville? Oh, I know the Beltsville Bee Lab in Maryland, right?
Yeah.
Do you know what's their formula? Do you know?
Not offhand, but it's Daydance changed it.
Oh, really? They tweaked it and... Okay. I get the impression that Daydance is not really interested in telling me what's in their syrup or in their supplements. But yeah, I'm a little curious. I know a lot of the guys when they get really big and you're starting to manage, 1,000+ hives, a lot of people start coming up with their own formulations.
You couldn't take their stuff and do some lab things on it and figure it out, or
I'm not a chemist.
Student project.
Student project.
yeah.
There you go. Ramir, unfortunately, has already signed up for you're doing a pathology project, right?
Pistachios.
Pistachios, that's right, yeah. Well, you're no good to me. I'll just give you your seed to let you graduate and get you out of here. Yeah, alternatively, if you want to collect pollen and use it to make your own pollen supplements, you can use something called a pollen trap. This is one form of a pollen trap. The other pollen traps I've seen are like a piece of sheet metal with holes drilled in them that are just slightly larger than a bee. The idea is when the bees crawl through the hole to get into the hive, some of the bees will have their little pollen ball, their bee bread scraped off, right, out of the corbicula, and it'll just sort of settle into a little trap, and you can empty that out every once in a while and use that pollen to make your own supplement, or you can sell it. Lots of people like to buy bee pollen as a health food. But yeah, what I've seen a fair bit of is people will make their own supplement since it is relatively inexpensive. And yeah, you can see they're just going through with like a spoon and scooping it up and plopping it in. If you go to Daydant and talk to Stan, he's got some pictures of a day he went out with one of the commercial guys. And what they do is they make a big loaf of it. And they've got one of those like pizza cutters, the ones that go like this, right? And they just go chunk, 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 chunk down the loaf and create these thin slices that they just plop right onto the tops of their hives. So it's pretty automated.
Would you want to kill feed this with the sugar water?
I think that's going to depend on the time of year. And it's going to depend on your needs. So, yeah, maybe if you had a really weak hive, right, at the beginning of the season, and you don't think they have enough resources to, one, feed themselves and their brood, and they don't have a whole lot of brood going, then pollen can be a good way to sort of stimulate brood production.
No, I think you just answered my. I was gonna say I wanted to do splits. I wanted to build up my hives this year, and I wanted to stimulate a bunch of brood production. Could I just potentially feed them sugar syrup and pollen, throughout the season?
And I'm not absolutely certain. Do you have any insight, Bob?
I give them pollen patties year round.
You give them year round? Okay. And I've heard that too.
The pollen short area.
Mm-hmm. That's true. So something to keep in mind is I'm getting a lot of this information from the Karen book, and that's written by a bunch of guys in Delaware. And they more or less have pollen and nectar forage year-round. So they're a little less focused on this. Here in California, especially in the Central Valley, it is a we're in a pollen deficit during a good chunk of the year. So unless your bees are in like a urban setting where there's a lot of flowering resources all the time, you're probably going to have to supplement. And so you feed them all year round then with the pollen.
Yeah.
Okay, and do you use like just a supplement, or are you giving them actually? Sorry?
The data patties, 8P23 or whatever.
Mm-hmm. Okay, sure. And we've got some of those laying around here somewhere. I'm sure I can dig them out. Oh no, I put them in the freezer. Did I put them in this freezer? Are they pretty cheap? The patties?
Yeah.
I've been waiting a couple of weeks. See the cheese.
Not sure where I put those. I might have put them in the freezer over at the OH unit. How much did the patties cost?
Huh?
How much did the patties cost? The AP23s?
Oh, wow.
Or is it 10
Buck a
patties
patty.
A buck a patty? Yeah. So not an insignificant amount.
You buy a pallet or a box of 40 pound, box.
Okay.
40 pounds is 80.
40 pounds is 80? Okay. Huh. Well, there you go.
They go through a patty pretty quickly, or
Do they go through a patty pretty quickly?
Depends on the season, a couple of weeks,
Mm-hmm.
and the size of the hive.
Yeah. Unfortunately, the general impression I get is that beekeeping in California is like all agriculture in California. It's pretty different from the way they do it in the rest of the country. And but the problem is most of the country is who writes the textbooks and the rest of this stuff. So it's kind of like I'm getting a general overview of this stuff, and then I look around at how we do things here in California. I'm like, crap.
Should write a textbook.
Yeah.
Should. There we go. Or at least I should take somebody else's textbook and insert a couple like little boxes like, hey, if you're in California,
We know that
yeah, watch out. Well, it's like that one chapter in the book was about forage resource, and they're like, oh yeah, just find a nice block in the woods, you put down your bees, and you know what? The first thing they'll do is they'll just go and feed on the winter weeds. That's great. And then they'll go and feed on the tulip poplars. Then they'll go and feed on this and this and this. I'm like, yeah, we got like 2 trees here in Fresno. Well, in Fresno we have a bunch of trees. But like, if I'm out in the country, it's like what's growing out there? There's some oaks. And the bees will go after oak, but oak doesn't bloom all the time. And then there's maybe some trees people have in their front yard, and there's almonds and pistachios. And
What was sort of funny was after we went to Bayer, like I started to realize like my dad's sort of picky about like the stuff that he puts in our front yard and backyard to like decorate it. I don't know, like he pays a lot of attention to that. There's actually a lot of bee forage
yeah.
in my front yard. I didn't realize,
Yeah, and that's what I've been thinking about too, is just like getting rid of my lawn because I'm tired of irrigating it as much as we are for stupid grass that I hate anyway. Because my grass is probably like if y'all are working on your weed collection, it's getting pretty funky out there. It's a Bermuda grass heaven. But anyway, yeah, I've just been thinking about what I need to do to kill it, and then I'm like, well, let's put out some ceanthus and some butterfly bush and some other stuff. Like, let's get some stuff for bees. That would be nice, and you don't have to water a ton of it. I think that's why I was impressed with Rocky's Forge. A lot of that stuff takes, 2 gallons of water a month? It's like, it's not an unreasonable amount of water to give a plant. So, and hers blooms all year round, so that's nice for bees. I'll take that. Anyway, oh, beautiful. We might actually get on schedule today. And that's with me talking off topic and all this stuff. So, fall and winter management. So there definitely is some seasonality to bees, just like there's seasonality to all agriculture, right? And much like in the rest of agriculture, sort of the defining event of maintaining your beehives is the overwintering period, prepping them for the season where they're going to be basically stuck in the hives. Now, here's my big caveat. This is, again, something that matters more to the rest of the country than it does here in California. Because if you're beekeeping up in Canada, the northern Midwest, the East Coast or something, the winter period is going to be when there virtually is no forage. And while we definitely see a decrease in forage here in California, it never really gets so truly cold in the wintertime that the bees go into a true overwintering, status. Bees here in California tend to go out and forage all winter long, or at least do sort of minor foraging during that period. I don't know, or am I being incorrect?
Well, they come out and poop.
They do come out and poop.
Yeah.
But
And they get diarrhea.
mhm.
Cover the hive with diarrhea. Some places with them trapped in for 3 weeks,
Mhm.
and the thaw comes, they'll come out.
Mhm.
Whole place is covered with gold.
It's true. But yeah, so we do get some overwintering, but it's not as severe as we see in other parts of the country, which can be good and can be bad at the same time. So ultimately, when we're talking about fall management, what we're talking about is basically the period from about August to October. Here, because it's a little warmer, you can stretch this out a little bit further. But functionally, what you're doing during this period is you're inspecting your hives and you're making sure they have adequate food for overwintering and that the bees are healthy and ready to go. So fall inspections are really sort of the key during this period. In general, you're going to do your fall inspection right after you've harvested all the surplus honey from the hives, sort of your final collection. And there's two major inspections that occur, typically in the northern climates, round about here as well. But basically, round about Labor Day, so the beginning of September, end of August, you're going to do a hive assessment. This is when you pop open the hives after they've had their summer foraging period, and you're basically checking, what's my hive strength, how many resources do they have, what does their health look like? Then you take corrective action at that point. So if you're seeing, say, high mite populations, you may apply a miticide, you may insert some brood comb to collect mites, any number of approaches that we'll talk about later. Maybe if you have a weak hive, you'll put in some honey or you'll give them some extra feed. And then around about Columbus Day, you come back and you check them again, and you basically see, did my corrective actions, have the desired effect? Are my hives looking better now for the winter period? And then ideally after that, you're going to have that cold weather come in, the bees will go into their overwintering pattern, and you basically don't want to open up the hives a whole lot then because you're going to stress them out and introduce cold air to the hive. So what are we looking for? Basically, we're looking for all the standard stuff that we're looking for during a normal hive inspection. We're looking for the amount and location of honey, the extent and pattern of brood, the size of the adult population, the general health, and then the condition of your comb and equipment. So basically, it's just a nice standard overview of how your bees are looking. So food, let's talk about food. So during the winter, bees don't really forage. That's sort of the norm of winter time, is the bees stay inside the hive and they just feed off of any honey reserves that you have laying around. Now a big question we see is, well, how many reserves do I need to leave for my bees? Because if you're out there and you're collecting honey and that's why you have bees, at the end of the summer, or the fall, there's oftentimes sort of a secondary nectar flow during the fall where you can get some extra honey. You want to kind of go out there and get the surplus honey and extract it. So how much do you need to leave behind? The rule of thumb I've seen is that you need to leave between 40 and 90 pounds of honey in the hive for the bees. And that's going to differ depending on what region you're in. So if you're like in the southeastern United States, you're keeping your bees in Florida, southern Georgia, the Gulf region, where it never really gets that cold, you can get away with as little as 40 pounds. That seems to be sort of the bottom recommendation. If you're up in Minnesota or Canada, Maine, whatever, you're going to need about that full 90 pounds to keep your bees going. And anywhere in between, you can sort of adjust. So, yes?
Is that 40 pounds because they can still forage and there's forage available to them in the southeast?
I believe that's the general, I think that's part of it. I think the other part of it is that they burn through a lot of energy keeping the hive warm. So it takes more energy, obviously, to heat up a hive if it's, 5 degrees outside versus if it's 55,
So do you think the 40 would be something around here too?
Probably not. You probably want to go higher than 40. About how much are you leaving with your bees?
40 pounds is 8 frames. They say 5 pounds per frame of honey.
Mm-hmm.
You got a whole box.
And that's about what you're doing?
Honey, not quite.
Not quite. Okay. So looks like we're a little on the lower end then.
Yeah.
Okay. Cool. So yeah, so 40.
From the population.
Yeah, that's true. So it is going to depend on your population. If you've got a big, strong hive, you're going to need to leave extra.
Yeah, I want an extra box.
Mm-hmm. So that raises a question of how do I know if my bees have enough food? What about is 40 pounds? So one thing you can do is you can directly weigh the hives to see how much is in there. Some people do this. This is what they do at Bayer. They've got these fancy, basically gigantic bathroom scales that the hives sit on, and they keep track of their weight all year round. Rocky talked about how they moved their hives to this guy's backyard in Kerman, and they gained weight like crazy. The reason they know that is they get updates from these scales every couple of minutes or so they can track the weight gain. That being said, obviously this is not super practical if you're doing a large-scale process. Just some other scales I saw. This is one where basically you just lift up the edge of the box and can use just sort of like a standard like fish scale to measure it. Or this is a torque-based scale where you have a ratcheting wrench. You pop it in there and you just crank it up and it measures the torque and converts that into weight. But you can use that to get an estimate about how much honey is left. But Bebop pointed out sort of what's a practical way that a lot of beekeepers use, which is basically just pulling the frames and estimating how much honey is in there. What you could do is basically open the hive, inspect all the frames, get a count of how many frames have capped honey in it, get an idea of what the coverage is within the frames. Do you have like 100% full frames or more like 70% full frames? And then you can basically just count up the number of frames and estimate how much you get. So a deep frame in general is going to have about 8 pounds of honey per frame, whereas a medium frame is going to have somewhere between 5 and 6 pounds of honey in it. So you said 5, right? It's sort of your estimate number, right?
That was from Davis.
That's from Davis, sure. So I saw numbers all over the place. So 5 or 6 pounds seems about right. So if you want 40 pounds, right, you just sort of make sure that I have at least like 8 medium frames of honey, or even maybe a full 10, sitting there on top of the hive box, if you want to be a little more conservative. All right, so what happens if you open up the frames and you're looking in your box and you're saying, boy, there's not enough honey in here to get my bees through? Well, you have a couple options. One thing you can do is feed them that heavy syrup, like we talked about before, that 2-to-1 ratio of sugar to water. You can pop that on top and basically just keep feeding them. There's sometimes a question of how much sugar should I feed them, and the recommendation they say in the book is basically just feed them until they stop taking it. You can't overfeed syrup, so bees will just sort of take it until they don't feel like they need any more. So you can just keep supplying it.
Then you can extract it and bottle it.
Yeah. Yeah, that would be the issue. So hopefully if you're doing this in the fall time, after you've done all your extractions, you would hope that the bees consume it all before you extract honey again.
There was a guy at the state bee meeting in Long Beach one year at the Queen Mary.
Uh-huh.
They had green and red combs stored his sugar syrup.
Okay,
So he was selling comb honey.
that's basically sugar water.
Well, that's what, it was white comb with green sugar syrup stored in it, capped over it. Selling it as comb honey.
Well, like we said, there's not a huge number of checks on the quality of honey. We've talked about the honey laundering with Pat last time, right? But yeah, and then like we also said earlier, right, you can also feed them honey directly. So we talked about slashing the frames before putting them in. This again encourages the bees to repackage the honey down in the bottom box, which is where they're going to start their winter around the brood. So you don't have to slash it, but some people recommend that as a way to compact the brood. I also saw a recommendation that if you have a bunch of honey laying around, you can extract the honey and feed it to the bees as a sugar solution, so a 1-to-1 honey to water ratio. I'm not sure I would go through the trouble of that if I can just pop a frame in. So, yeah. And again, as I said earlier, don't provide them with the liquid solution once you get into the actual winter period, because it will drip on them and cause trouble. And oftentimes, the bees also are going to be down in the bottom of the hive, so they're not even going to come up and get that syrup. All right, so fall brood in adults. So I mentioned the fact that you should look in the hive and make sure it's large enough to survive the winter, which raises the question, how many bees do I actually need to survive the winter? A typical stat is that most hives will lose about half of their workers over the winter period. So you want to make sure you have a large enough colony that they can withstand those losses by the time they come out. The number I've seen thrown around a bit is this idea of having around 30,000 workers in the hive. 30,000 is roughly equivalent to 10 pounds of bees, or enough to cover 5 to 6 frames completely. So when you're pulling them out and you're taking a look at these frames, you know, if you've got 5 or 6 frames you can pull out and they're pretty well covered in workers, you're in good shape for that winter period. Now, if you're pulling out those frames and you're thinking, boy, these bees are a little bit small, it's good practice to try and boost those hives as much as possible before the winter period starts. So one way you can do that is you can stimulate egg laying with sugar syrup. So if you put some sugar syrup and some pollen patties in there, that's going to encourage the queen to start laying more eggs. And when she lays eggs, an advantage of that, well, so 2 advantages here. If you give the bees syrup, what they're going to do is take that syrup, and the first place they're going to put it is they're going to start putting it in empty brood cells. So they're going to take that syrup down to the bottom box, and they're going to start putting it around the brood. Then the queen is going to be forced to start laying her eggs more towards the center of the brood area. So she's going to start laying her eggs all in a nice compact bunch right in the middle. And so it's basically going to help you by stimulating brood laying and also compacting the brood, which is important. We'll get to that in a minute. One recommendation I saw was that if you're worried about the queen wandering a lot and you want her to stay in the bottom box and to build the brood at the bottom of the hive where it's supposed to be, you can put a queen excluder on top of the bottom box. And that's a good way to keep her down there and make sure she's building that brood ball where you want it. Downside of this is that you do need to make sure you take that off in the winter. During the winter time, the bees will start at the bottom of the hive and work their way upwards as they eat through their reserves. And if the queen gets stuck on the wrong side of the excluder, you're going to have a dead hive. So, or at least a queenless hive in the springtime. So make sure you take that excluder off.
When would you get rid of the supers?
The supers?
Columbus Day, or-
Well, so like Bebog was saying, a super with 8 or 9 frames in it full of honey is about what you need to provide for them to overwinter. So you want to leave at least 1 super usually, right? Or at least sufficient food for them to keep. As far as removing supers for like a honey flow, it's really going to depend on a case-by-case basis. So maybe you have something come through and you've got a bunch of nectar and you have excess honey to harvest. Sometimes, you'll get some sort of fall weed that comes up that produces a ton of nectar, and you'll get a late honey rush. Some years you won't. So it's really just going to depend. When you open up your hives, if you notice the bees are full up to the top and they've got everything full, then you might want to do some extra supering. But if you're noticing the hives are a little light, then you might just say, we're going to call it off early this year. No more supering. So another thing you can do, so let's say you have some weak colonies, and you don't think your weak colonies are going to make it. You don't think that you can give them enough food for them to overcome their weakness and become strong enough to survive the winter. In that case, what you can do is take weak colonies and you can combine them together to create a stronger colony. Now, this is a method I saw recommended, where basically what you can do is, let's say you have two weak colonies you want to combine. You can take one of those colonies, and if one of them is queenless, which happens every once in a while, then this is going to be relatively straightforward. If it's not, you have to kill the queen in one of the hives. You can basically take the hive body from one, open it up, and put a layer of newspaper on the top of it. So here we have one hive body with some newspaper on it. And then basically you take the second hive body, the one without the queen, and you just put it right on top of the one with the newspaper. The newspaper provides a little bit of a barrier between the two, so the bees can't get at each other right away. It allows the smell to permeate across slowly over time. The bees get used to the idea of each other, and once the bees manage to chew through and get at each other, they generally will combine and form a cohesive colony that works together. So you go from having two weak colonies to one strong one. One trick with this is that idea I talked about before, that if you move a colony of bees, you need to move them 2 feet or 2 inches or 2 miles, right? You want to make sure that your hives, you don't move them just a little bit, because the workers will have a hard time finding it. So if you're going to combine hives like this, oftentimes you need to do it at a second location that's several miles away from your normal apiary. Because when you put this top box on the bottom box, the workers in here are going to have a hard time finding their new home. So you want to do it somewhere far away until they get used to each other, then ship it back to where you are. All right. I got 1 minute. I can wrap this part up. Another thing you could do to strengthen colonies is you can transfer combs of brood from a strong hive to a weak hive. So if you have, basically bees are not picky about where brood comes from. So if you've got a strong hive that's producing frame after frame of beautiful brood, you can pop one of those brood frames out, maybe 2 or 3, brush the workers off, and you can slide it right into a weak hive. And when those brood emerge, those bees will basically be workers for that weak hive. So it's sort of an instant upgrade in worker population. The only trick is you have to make sure that you get rid of the adults. You don't want to stick a bunch of adult workers in a hive they don't belong to. That'll cause trouble. Yeah, there's enough there that we'll just cover that next time. And then very last, I'm going to cover this, and that way I can start on something new next week, or on Thursday. Fall requeening. So, oftentimes a young queen will increase your chances of survival and reduce swarming in the next year. So if you've got boxes that you know have old queens, and they seem to be struggling, early fall is a good time to requeen. And in general, you only want to do this if you have a good adult population in the hive that can withstand the process of getting a new queen. Recommended procedures are you can use that newspaper method we talked about before. You can purchase a new queen in the cage and introduce that to the hive in sort of the standard way, which we'll talk about later. Or you can purchase a virgin queen cell and put that in your hive up against one of the brood frames, so that when the new queen emerges, she'll take over. But you want to make sure you do this early in the fall. You want to do this at that first check, round about Labor Day, because you need to give the queen enough time to establish, build up that brood, and basically get the hive up and running and in tip-top shape before winter comes. And when you do requeen, it's recommended you give them some extra food, either sugar or honey. So with that, next time we'll pick up on health, and then we'll jump into summer maintenance, and that'll be it for our seasonal cycle. After IPM lab today, I'm going to go out to the hive and give it some new food and the like. So once I get my final schedule for when I'm meeting with the IPM teams today, I'll send out an email to the class basically saying when I'll be out there. So if you're interested in getting in the hives and taking a look around, just swing by the OH unit at the time I email about.